Have you ever wondered what makes a genius recipe genius? Or how Kristen Miglore, the person behind Food52's Genius Recipes column, got her start? We have all that and more on today's episode. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and joining me is Molly Stevens. Today on the show, we're going to talk about how some recipes stand out from the pack and why some maybe even could be called genius. Hey, Molly.
Kate, how are you?
I'm doing all right. I can't wait to delve into what it takes for a recipe to stand out from the pack. Before we get into today's interview, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your work on the Best American Recipes series. I mean, how did these books come together? Because I feel like this is something that's going to come up in our interview today on what makes a recipe kind of stand out.
Yeah, it's funny you should ask, because when I was thinking about talking to Kristen about the Genius Recipe, and we'll get more into what that all is, I was remembering that for 6-7 years, I worked on a series for Houghton Mifflin, the Best American Recipe series. They started in 1999 was the first, and I was actually not involved with the first one, but I worked on the next 6 years. Best American Recipes, it was an annual edition, and I think the subtitle was The Year's Top Picks, recipe top picks from books, magazines, newspapers, the internet. And so it was meant to be this kind of crowdsourcing, but I did it with another editor, Fran McCullough, and we just turned up every source we could find. We went through the new books, we went through the magazines, we'd ask, I remember the one came from a UPS driver. We were kind of trying to find out what recipes people were talking about, what ones were getting people excited, what ones stood out. I'm really excited to talk to Kristen about her process, but also, how do you decide what's a recipe that, whether it's something that you've always made, but this is a new twist on it, or it's the kind of recipe when you make it, people ask you for the recipe. You take something to somebody's house and they're like, oh my gosh, you have to give me this recipe. Or they come for dinner, you have to give me this recipe. Just those things that sort of change the way you cook or think about food. It's funny because, so we ended in 2006. Ultimately, it was untenable as a project. It was just
huge. That's just a huge project.
It was a huge project in the timeline because we all had to test all these recipes too.
I was just thinking, your kitchen must have been a little bananas.
It was bananas. And to keep it timely, because we were trying to do it in a calendar year, but it's so funny. So we ended in 2006 with our final edition. And then in 2009, Food52 started.
I remember that.
Yeah,
I remember
right?
getting the press release about it and thinking, Food52, it's going to be online. It's with Amanda Hesser coming from the New York Times. She's a big deal, so she must be really onto something. Because I mean, we all knew she was smart, and she always seemed to be a step ahead. But I wasn't sure until I saw the site. I wasn't really sure if I understood what it was going to be or what it was going to become. And I don't think any of us foresaw what it was going to become.
No, and I think, and we can ask Kristen, because it feels like it started, the 52 was about 52 recipes in a calendar year, and they got a cookbook deal. And so they were going to come up with 52 exceptional recipes that stood out, and then somehow through this interface. But anyway, it was interesting to me from a personal career history to put two and two together with this Best American work and then Food52. So I'm really excited to talk to Kristen about her work both with Food52 and on her own books.
Right. On finding these recipes, because you know how hard it is. And kind of sometimes it's not the most obvious recipe. That's the one that people remember. So that'll be fun to hear about what stands out in her mind. Let me introduce her a little bit more. So Kristen Miglore, you may recognize her name from her popular Genius Recipe column on Food52, where she actually was the founding editor, which I find really, really, really cool. She also has her own podcast, Genius Recipe Tapes, so you can listen to her there. And what we're going to talk to her today is about her latest in the best-selling Genius Recipes cookbook series, Simply Genius, and also learn the backstory of how these books are made. So on that note, let's get into it. Kristen, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
We're excited to have you.
We're really excited to delve into the world of Genius Recipes, and congratulations on having the third book come out in the series.
Thank you so much. And thank you for making this show, because I listen to it sort of fervently every episode. And I'm like, oh, I wish I knew that. Some of it sounds familiar from having gone through the book process a few times, but some of it I'm like, oh, wow, that's such a great idea. There's so much to learn about every step of the process from you and all your guests. So thank you.
Wow. That's like the best feedback ever. Thank you so much, Kristen. And I honestly, Molly, I think you'd agree with me. We learn from each other on this podcast. When we're talking about things, I'm like, oh, I'm going to write a note. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason that we've started the podcast is because we've been having these conversations for many, many years, and we learn from each other. We've all been around the block several times, but we're still learning, and every project is different, and now learning from our guests. So that means an awful lot coming from you, and we're excited to be making more episodes.
So, Kristen, one of the things that you're really known for is finding these like gems, these techniques or flavor combinations or something that can kind of be game changers for home cooks. I'm thinking in Genius Desserts, which I have in front of me, you had this recipe from Marcella Hazan. It was for, I think, the crocante. And there was a tip in there where you use a potato to smooth out, was it like the caramel? So when it cooled, it would have this nice surface. And things like that. It's pretty incredible, but I know that you weren't born a recipe, hunter. So let's rewind a little bit and just get some of your backstory. How did you get to Food 52, and were you pretty much like the first employee?
I was the first employee. So I started in 2010. The way I got there was I started my career as an economic analyst, actually. In college, I majored in econ and minored in writing and editing and was kind of equally interested in both, but it was easier to get an econ job. And once I got into it, I kind of realized in retrospect that the things I liked about my econ classes was the storytelling. Like I really enjoyed all the sort of like economic history and business history classes. And then when I got into it, I was actually the first 2 years of my career, I was analyzing exclusively car lease portfolios full of car leases, which I'm sure for people who are interested in cars is like pretty interesting. But for me, it wasn't. And really the thing that I loved most about those jobs was that like I had really generous coworkers who were like excited to invite the new girl to lunch and like show off their favorite like burrito spot or their favorite place to get, like katsu curry or something. And so that was what I looked forward to, was like getting to discover these places. And then I would just sit in my cubicle and think about what I was going to be making for dinner the rest of the time. Gosh. So I realized after a few years of that like, what if I could take the thing that was in my brain all the time and try to work in it? And so, I kept applying when I would see jobs pop up when Bon Appetit was in LA. And I lived in near LA in Santa Barbara at the time. I kept applying there and I never heard back. I didn't really have enough. Just my writing minor didn't really get me very far. So one day in frustration, I just Googled food studies because I was like, there's, kind of a little uncreatively, like, I was like, I can't get a job. I guess I better go to school to try and get a job. So I didn't really like the alternate paths that exist now weren't really as obvious back then.
Right.
So I ended up finding the food studies master's program at NYU, and that's what brought me to New York. And at the moment that I was about to graduate from that program, September 2009 was the month that Gourmet Magazine folded and Food 52 launched. So I always think of that as this like huge turning point in the industry where like suddenly food magazine jobs were going to be even harder to find. And it seemed like a good time to be, getting to know how to write about food for the internet. Luckily, being in New York and like having done a lot of internships and odd jobs and connected with people through that program, I found out about Food 52 looking for some help, both cooking and editorial help when they were first getting started. So that's how I got connected there, and I never left.
That's amazing.
Right. You never felt like, wow, those car leases, I really kind of miss that life.
Honestly, all I really remember is that like, what is it? Like BMWs hold their value pretty well. Like that's about all I got.
But you heard it here first.
Listening to that origin story, I'm thinking, econ, how does that? But the analysis part, obviously a brain that can sort of sift through a lot and find patterns and see things that stand out. So I'm so curious. I remember very well when Amanda and Meryl started up Food 52. So you're the first team member, first employee, first hire. how did the genius idea come up?
So I'd been working there for about a year. Our main thing back then was running these recipe contests, and we didn't have an office. We would get together once a week in Amanda's apartment kitchen and do our photo shoots, mostly of recipes that had won these contests from people who had submitted them from all over the world. You know, people who had food blogs, who were lawyers by day, like people who just wanted to participate in something. That was kind of the early bones of Food 52. And the 52 in the beginning was because we were going to build a cookbook in 52 weeks with all of these contest-winning recipes. But we also did other stuff. We had other columns from the beginning. We had a shop from the beginning.
It was sort of crowdsourcing was the original idea, I remember. And were these recipes coming from the contributor, from the crowd?
Yeah.
Good question.
The recipes would be submitted by anyone who wanted to sign up and share a recipe, usually on a theme for one of our contests. And all of the winners of those contests at the end of a year would go into a cookbook. That was how the site started. But at the same time, we also, like Amanda and Meryl had a column. We had columns from other, Jennifer Steinhauer was an early columnist for us. I loved editing her column because she kind of showed me like what voice in recipe writing and blogging could be, that it could be like kind of snarky and funny and smart. So there was a lot going on in that year. And over the course of that year, Amanda and Meryl were like, hey, we want you to start a column. You should have your own byline on the site. And at first it was going to be like a cooking basics kind of thing, because I was closer to having gone to culinary school and being earlier on in my career. So the problem was we never really got excited about that idea. And so it never really took off because so many places had done it so well. But we kept talking about recipes like Marcella Hazan's tomato sauce and these recipes that, like, once you start talking to people about food and you meet people who care about food, they tell each other about and like circulate in blogs in the early days of food blogs, now circulate on social media. I guess sort of viral recipes in a way, like
the no-knead bread.
So that's one type of, I think, genius recipe is the type that like has something so memorable that it just kind of spreads like wildfire. So we started talking about this more and more, but I really have to say Amanda Hesser is the one who kind of honed in on this being the idea for like, okay, scrap the cooking basics. This is something that like nobody's really talking about and has like, you know, there's a lot of meat there that we could really cover, and came up with the idea of genius recipes and then just kind of handed it to me to run with.
Amazing. So I know you explained very well both on the column, in the column, and in the introduction to your cookbooks. But maybe if you could summarize just for the podcast, what makes a recipe a genius recipe?
Sure. I think the most basic form of it is summed up in the subtitle of the first book, which is recipes that will change the way you cook. But the way that manifests, I think, is that they have some memorable detail. I mean, in my favorite ones, in the best case ones, it's something like that potato detail. Like you're like, what? This is so wacky. How did she discover that a potato was a better way of smoothing a bubbling hot caramel than like a silicone spatula or even an oiled spatula? I tried both. I think it's the wetness, the steam of the potato sort of like helps push away and lubricate in a way that like even an oiled spatula will stick.
And it's cool too. There's something about it. And let's be clear, it's a potato that's been cut in half. So you have the flat size of the inside. So that's where that moisture is coming from inside the potato.
Interesting that it doesn't leave a slick onto the caramel, because you would think that it would either, that starchiness of the potato would come, but it doesn't because it's just too hot. It's quick. I don't know. That's just a little bit of culinary magic.
Yeah, it might leave a bit of, whatever the matter that gets left behind of the potato when the water steams off, but it cooks. So it's not like you're left with like raw potato juice or anything. And it just kind of like becomes part of the caramel and doesn't affect the flavor at all.
So I just have to say, sidebar, we could sit here and that's one genius tip out of
one
hundreds,
genius tip out of how many?
Thousands in these 3 books and the column. So we're just going deep on this one, and it takes up like just this little paragraph of space in the book. So
it seems to me that you're saying that the genius recipes are both those sort of ones that went viral before we said viral recipes, the ones that people just kept handing down to everybody. Mm-hmm. And then there's the other ones where they're these just little gems, these tips that maybe they're overlooked or maybe people have been doing it and they don't think it's that interesting because that's how they've always done it. But then you find it and you tease it out and then you put it in these books or in your column and it's like, wow, potato, caramel, why not, you know?
Yeah. I think of them as like the, sort of greatest hits of the food world, plus the under the radar gems. I think I said this on the back of the Genius dessert. I'm just basically like parroting my cover copy now, but like,
Very smart.
Things that I think deserve that kind of reputation. And I am certainly not the only person who is looking for them. The Food 52 community, I've been asking for their help from the very first column to help me find them because I am a researcher. I love going down rabbit holes. I love reading cookbooks and stumbling on things that I think are interesting, but I would never have been able to do it for as long as I have without this collective wisdom of all of these home cooks and, people like yourselves. I've reached out to you and other people I admire, cookbook authors, food editors who've seen a lot of recipes and will remember the ones that stuck too when I'm trying to find the recipes for these books.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I notice in your Genius recipes, and for example, the broccoli cooked forever, that Roy Finnemore was in Roy Finnemore's book, Tasty, and I think you do even say this in the head note. That's a technique. It's a recipe, but you can extrapolate the technique and riff on it and do other things with it. And I know, like when I did the Best American Recipe series for many years, and it's a similar kind of searching for, but we're looking for a recipe that once you make it your own, it changes the way you cook because then you can just interpret it and take it in, work it into your own cooking repertoire. So I think those are the recipes that we keep. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
One thing that's really interesting, too, about Genius Recipes is the voice. I mean, you are the voice, but you're also working within the Food 52 parameters. But, I mean, the voice, we were both talking about this earlier. It's kind of funny. It's practical. It's knowledgeable. It basically, it's like a good friend who's telling you, oh, you should try this. But it's not forcing the issue. And it's a delicate balance by saying, this is really great, but also giving the reader sort of the understanding that you'll figure out for yourself if you want to give it a try. And how did that voice evolve? I mean, that's like it's not easy. I mean, maybe it's over time. I mean, when you look back at your earlier columns or the first book, how do you think your voice has changed since then?
It means a lot to me that you've honed in on that because, as someone who's been working in food for as long as I have now, but I have not developed a lot of my own recipes. Like I think of myself a little bit more as a reporter because I'm finding these and then researching and telling the story behind them or how they can fit into your life. But I feel like voice is the main thing I can bring to these recipes besides just not messing them up. Like I take that responsibility really, really seriously too, that I don't want to take a recipe that was great and then put it in my book and have an error in it or something. So like I think of myself as a steward, but also as just like trying to share, my own experience of what, why I thought this was so great and how it can fit into other people's lives. In terms of how it's evolved over the years, I think I tried really, really hard in the beginning, I think because of that, maybe it was overcompensating a little bit for like, well, these are other people's recipes. I really need to like sparkle here. So I think there was a little more of the thesaurus involved.
A little more jazz hands.
Yeah, a little more like staying up all night, crafting and recrafting intros and stuff. I mean, really like the first couple years of the column, I just like stayed at the Food 52 co-working space all night writing them because I'm a terrible procrastinator. And I don't know, that's how I did it. I was really obsessive about it. Better now, a little more relaxed now. So I think over time I've dropped some of the fancy words, but through the whole time I always thought that it was better if it sounded like it was just a human talking as opposed to, a 5-paragraph essay. But I think that's pretty common in, blogging, in writing Instagram captions. Like we want to hear the person's writing approximately as they would speak. And so that's what I always tried to do. And then just kind of like weaned off of the thesaurus. I think the thesaurus thing, I actually took a food writing class with Lori Buckle, a former managing editor at Bon Appetit.
Sure.
In 2006, right before I was coming to New York to start working in food. And I think I learned from her, you really want the thesaurus, but you got to step away.
Right.
If your sentences are like beautiful, but no one can read them, then people aren't going to make it very far.
The voice is so personal. I mean, these books come out of Food 52, but it's very first person, singular. You get the sense that you're there with, it's your speaking voice. And I almost see it as a sense of confidence that comes out, or just relaxing a little bit into it as your voices evolve. But so much that you, like I saw in one recipe, instead of put in the refrigerator or refrigerate it, you say fridge it. You may like nobody says fridging it, and you made up a word, or you're describing a tomato, and everybody says, when the sort of orthodox way of food writing is to the stem end or the core end, and you talk about the dry scar at the top, which is just very descriptive and original, and so it's very clear. And so you get a recipe that's written in another author's voice, but then you rewrite the entire thing.
In the books now, yes, although that's been an evolution too.
Okay.
In the first book, we sought permission from publishers ultimately. And so we were reprinting the recipes almost verbatim. I wrote the head notes, but the instructions was in the original author's voices. I would only add in additional tips from me, or there were certain things that I pushed back at first, like in this recipe it says tea towel, and in this recipe it says kitchen towel.
Right.
And I was like, who cares? Like, people can figure it out. But my editor wisely at the time was like, if someone's a beginner and they see kitchen towel and then they see tea towel, what if they think that a tea towel is actually a different type of object? So let's make it consistent, just so that in this one package, even if these two words are similar, people don't have to think about that. So there were little consistency things. But now, for this book in particular, because it was aimed at beginners initially, as well as busy cooks, I was really trying to do more hand-holding. So I was adding a lot more tips from my own experience, and also trying to use as like descriptive of language as possible. Like, I tried really hard to watch out for like culinary lingo that beginners might not recognize, and tried to kind of like write around that using just kind of average vocabulary.
Yeah.
That's so smart. So you don't have folded in, and then we have the Schitt's Creek moment where it's like just fold it in.
But it makes so much sense to do it that way, because the book has a consistency then. The voice is consistent throughout, as opposed to jumping around, which, we see a lot of compilation books that do that are simply cut and paste. And every recipe is a different experience, from a user standpoint. And it can be a little jarring if you are the user, because you're like, this said a tea towel, this said a kitchen towel, that sort of thing. So that's a very interesting evolution.
On that note, let's talk a little bit about the new book, Simply Genius, Recipes for Beginners, Busy Cooks, and Curious People. I mean, this book really does seem to be, like you were saying, it's for those beginners, but it's also for Molly and I are finding great ideas in there too. And what's so great about it is just it really seems to break the mold of how we're traditionally sort of taught to write cookbooks. There's so many visual cues in it, and certain things that are, I know from the back end, hard to do. Like Molly and I were talking before you got on about how you have, I think it's, Molly, correct me if I'm wrong, a pot of beans.
Yes.
And instead of saying, listing all the ingredients that go into that pot, you simply say, put everything in the photo in the pot. Something like that. I mean, and I'm thinking...
It says, put everything you see here into the pot, which...
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, when you're writing that recipe, you're not looking at anything except your keyboard and your screen. And yet you're visualizing either a photo or illustration, because you have both of these books. But it's such an interesting sort of use of the visual elements, really integrating it into the voice and the storytelling.
So how did you do that? How hard was it to integrate the visual storytelling, the actual verbiage that you're really carefully thinking through? I mean, it's a book for beginner cooks, but this sounds like a very complicated book to put together and have it be coherent and successful for cooks of all kinds.
It was much harder than I thought it would be. We started this book a long time ago. I think it took overall 4 years. Wow. The first book, I think I it was like a year and a half. That was pretty quick to put together, actually. Year and a half from start to finish. The second was more average, like 2 years or so. This one, for one thing, a lot of interruptions came up. I went on parental leave. The pandemic hit. I moved across the country a few times. So there were, we had supply chain issues, all kinds of different delays that caused that 4-year gap. So when we started, I was still creative director of Food52. So of the whole brand, not just the Genius part of it. So I had worked on a lot of photo shoots. I had done a lot of infographics, overseen a lot of visuals meet words. So that was where the initial idea for this book came from, was let's do a book for beginners where we really take our strengths in the studio and in creative and try to put those together in a new type of beginner book. But then doing that in a book form was, I'm glad you can appreciate that. It was really, really challenging, especially once the pandemic hit and I moved to California and my team is in New York, and some of 10 Speed is in California, but our designer is in New York. So all of this was conducted from afar over Zooms. On the first 2 books, I had the fortune of being able to be the on-set food stylist too. So I had a lot of help making the food in the kitchen, but I was the one putting the food on the plates. And this time I couldn't do that because I was here. So I was on Zoom, being very micromanaging, and our studio team was so generous and flexible with dealing with all of my notes. But I knew how the book was supposed to come together. And so I had a lot of notes on okay, here's where we need space to fit in a caption. Here's what we really need to change so that this matches the recipe and also matches this tip that's coming later. So it was just a lot of hovering, I guess.
Well, and just let's talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts on how that looks. You have a Google Doc, Word doc, whatever, and you have these recipes written down. But at what point does the photo shoot happen? Were you doing photo shoots ongoing through this, or was it just was it a sprint photo shoot that's just done in one fell swoop, and you're just trying to make sure you have all the words done ahead of time? How did that come together?
We usually try with our books to do at least 2 to 3 photo shoots so that we can capture different seasons. In New York, it's just harder to get good looking tomatoes or cherries out of season. I mean, I think it's hard to get good looking cherries out of season anywhere, I'm discovering. But we'll try to do one in the spring, one in late summer, just spread it out. That also helps if we realize we need to reshoot something. We realize something from the first shoot wasn't working and we want to kind of evolve to a different direction, or we had way too many blues in the first shoot. Let's start to lean towards peaches or something like that. So that's how that worked. I had already handed in the manuscript, I believe, when we did the first shoot, and we did 3 1 week long shoots. And then we had to do some, smaller 1 or 2 day reshoots. And then the cover was up until the 11th hour.
The cover always has to be up until the 11th hour, unless you get lucky. Something about a cover. There's just too much pressure on a cover.
So much writing on it. There's so many opinions. It's where the publisher really is super, super invested. Whereas internal photos, they at Food52, they tend to trust us to get those right.
There's so many more graphic elements as well. There's, the arrows and the different typeface, which I'm imagining as you're writing, you're identifying or you're going back through editing. And there's something I love is the bold-faced in the procedures, just a bold-faced, something that's is really essential. The most important part of this procedure is in boldface. So you could, at a quick glance, see it. So that, to me, I'm imagining as you're writing, you're imagining that, but also then you're going back during your edits and you're identifying, and then you use another color boldface. I think it was orange. So these helpful cues. Again, just adding complexity to it, but using that interface between the story and the visual. It's exciting. It's exciting to see. And you mentioned the cover, and that's what made me think about it, because the cover, I think the first 2 Genius, the first one being Genius and then Genius Baking, but those 2 look very much like a pair of books. They have a matching color, they're matching graphically, but this one really, the cover looks different. And I'm just wondering how deliberate that was.
The inside started first, that we really wanted to update. And frankly, we really started that with the Big Little Recipes cookbook from Emma LaPerouse that came out last fall. So with Big Little Recipes, that was the first time that we really worked closely with our new designer, Lizzie Allen, who we had just seen her books and they were so bold and colorful and did such interesting things with type and illustrations. And So Big Little Recipes was where we kind of carved out some of the new elements to the Food 52 books. And they just, it was just time for a refresh, I think. We were all like eager to get into more bright colors. There was always the joke in the early days that everything at Food 52 was gray, and that's not the case anymore. Genius Recipes came out in 2015, so it's been 7 years since that book. It was time for an evolution. But then the evolution of the inside, we really were trying to bring in more color and more new design elements, partly because it was time and partly because of it helping how we wanted to tell the story in this book, that we really wanted to bring in more hand-holding and visual cues. And then the cover sort of flowed from that. And it was really a challenge because I really hoped that the insides would be reflected in the cover. And I don't know, honestly, if we got there. Like, I think some of the boldness of the inside, like the cover looks very serene and simple, I think. But it was hard then to bring in some of the brighter, more playful, whimsical things to the cover without it feeling too gimmicky. So I think we kind of hit a middle ground there where, 10 Speed wanted the look of the cover to be the same sort of like straight on as opposed to overhead, if you know what I mean. Like the first one is looking across the horizon at spaghetti, the second one's chocolate cake, and then the third one is a roast chicken and salad. So that's the continuity there. But then, and the trim size is the same. So they do sit in a little threesome, but beyond that, a lot did change.
So the nice thing is on the shelf, you have all three books on the shelf. They're all going to look like they're in the family together. But you delve inside this book. And one of the things I just love is, how many people have questions about when brownies are done? Every time I make brownies, I find myself questioning, did I do this right? Is this enough crumb, the wet crumb on the toothpick or whatnot? And so you take the guesswork out and you just have pictures of all the possible doneness for brownies. And you do the same with salmon. And you do these visual cues throughout the book, but they're also tied in stylistically in a way that's fun and just enjoyable to look through. So I feel like it's a book that appeals to a broad range of cooks, not only beginners, but also just anybody who's just like, oh yeah, like I thought in my head that's what it should look like. But now I have this book that's helping me kind of think, yes, I'm on the right track. I'm not just like working in my silo. So I really appreciated that. And I could tell this is a lot of work. Can you talk a little bit about how you worked with 10 Speed then? Because you're an author, but you're also working with Food 52 and Genius Recipes as, the calling card as well. And then you also have to make sure that all those details get correct. And then you have these visuals. So I feel like working with an editor could be challenging because you know this world so well. How did you work together and what was that process like?
I think as we've done more books with 10 Speed, I think and it also depends editor to editor. Everyone has a different style. I was very heavily edited on the first book. And then as we got further along in our relationship with them, there's a lot of trust that they put in us to both for the content and also the visuals, because we do shoot everything in-house. So I would say less hand-holding, less guidance than in the very beginning, but still definitely there for any questions as a sort of gut check on anything. It's great because they're bringing a different perspective than we are. We have this like very internet first mentality about like, oh, everyone loves eggs. Everyone loves this or that. But just because you click on eggs doesn't mean that you want to buy a whole cookbook of them. So they bring that other perspective of, I was like, fried eggs on the cover. That's going to be perfect. It's going to be so poppy and fun. And always that performs on Instagram. But 10 Speed was like, you don't need to buy a whole cookbook for fried eggs. So like, let's do something a little bit more ambitious for the cover. So we were bringing those different perspectives, which was really, really useful. And I'm always so lucky that Food 52 is behind me. A lot of these moments with this book, it is just like me and my laptop, because that's how you have to write and how you have to kind of like put together a table of contents. But anytime I needed them, or especially on like book design decisions or, creative direction decisions, having a team there to gut check things with made it a little bit less lonely, or a lot less lonely, I think, than other writing projects could be.
Do you think your voice, the voice that's evolved through the Genius columns and now these 3 Genius cookbooks, and if you go off and write a freelance article for another outlet, do you feel like you have a Food 52 voice and that there'll be another Kristen Miglore voice?
It's an interesting question. I think that the Food 52 voice, I mean, I've lived and breathed it for so long, and it also spoke to me so much. I feel like, Amanda and Meryl really set the stage for it. We are having fun. We are sharing information. We're not taking ourselves too seriously, but we also are really excited to share these things that we've discovered. And that was always like the MO, and that spoke to me. And it's why I gravitated towards working with them. It's why I've enjoyed working with them for 12 years now. So I think there's some part of it that's pretty innate in me that will go with me wherever I write anything. And the same part that kind of like gets a kick out of something silly like a potato being the key ingredient to this recipe, even though it's not really in the recipe. Right. That kind of like whimsy, I think, will follow me. But I used to write freelance a bit, and I think you definitely like you get a vibe for the publication and what they're looking for, and kind of adapt a little bit for sure. I mean, it's similar for you both, right? I mean,
yeah, and it's something we talk about quite a bit. If you're writing for a magazine, for example, you want to find out what the vibe of the magazine is, or if you're doing a collaboration. So it is your voice, but it also has to vibe, as I said, with whatever brand or whoever you're working with. Right. Back to the evolution, I was thinking about like the chapter titles. The first book, there's a chapter for breakfast, as there should be, and expected. Right. And now in this one, you've got speedy, sensible workday breakfast and weekend fun breakfast. I mean, you can put fun right there in the title.
Yeah, and with this book, I really wanted it to speak to different needs that we all have and moments. Like, you're not going to make pancakes on a Monday necessarily, but you still want to have those recipes and you want to know where to find them. So rather than lumping them all into one chapter, trying to give a cue in the chapter title.
Right. And then thinking about that chapter title and giving it a fun name, not just saying breakfast, for the weekday. What recipes from the book do you find yourself turning to the most these days? I mean, when you finish a book, and this is perfectly valid, of not wanting to cook anything from that book for a while, or is with this book, since you lived with it for so long, are there just things that have naturally become part of your weekly repertoire?
I would say there's a couple breakfasts from the Speedy Sensible Workday Breakfast chapter that I've made consistently throughout. The one I probably make most often is a cocoa almond oatmeal. That one's from Samantha Senavaratna, and it has a lot of cocoa powder in it, and it's made in a skillet, a nonstick skillet, instead of in a pot. So that was like where the first kind of genius trick came to me from Sam. She works with us sometimes at Food52. She's a food stylist. And she was telling me one day about how she always makes her oatmeal in a nonstick skillet, because then you don't have to like soak the pot all day to get it to be easy to wash. It just wipes out really cleanly. So I was hooked on that idea. And then she sent me a recipe with all this cocoa powder in it. And I did not expect to love it as much as I did. And I do that now even when I'm making any oatmeal. But the cocoa almond combination in particular is just so unforgettable. And also it's something that my daughter asks for a lot. And it's really easy to make with her, because you just, dump everything in the skillet together. She can help me measure the cocoa powder and stuff, and then stick it on the stovetop and let it bubble down. It cooks a little bit quicker and creamier because there's a little more liquid over a wider surface area. And then there's like the bitterness from the cocoa powder, but then you swirl in some almond butter and do a little maple syrup. And just that combination of bitter and sweet and nutty and creamy is like the perfect breakfast. And it reminds me a little bit of like Cocoa Puffs or something, but more grown-up feeling.
I would turn that same idea and put it into a cookie. That sounds absolutely delicious for breakfast, but that flavor combination, I could see, put in some sour cherries, make it an oatmeal sour cherry chocolate almond cookie. And yeah, I'm going to try that for breakfast, because I do love like the unsweetened cocoa. Like you get certain cocos are just so good on their own. You don't need to make them in desserts. So this would be something I would definitely try.
Yeah.
These recipes aren't all for you, right? Like, it's not just the foods that you love. Like are there personal tastes you sometimes have to overlook, or personal distastes?
And maybe you can't say it, because Molly, what if she says a recipe that she doesn't like, but it's in the book? Like, she can't say that.
Okay, maybe it's more in the balance of a book. It's meant to have everything from breakfast to dessert. So you have to have all these different, you have to have vegetables, you have to have main courses, you have to, how do you sort of achieve that balance if really what you'd really just like to eat all day is oatmeal?
So this is such a great and interesting question to think about. And at first I was like, I I think maybe I'm selfish or maybe I just like many things, but like I think I would love to eat everything in this book. I think where that comes into play, though, is that like I do feel like I need to include recipes for needs that I might not have at the moment. Like I was writing this in the pandemic and, with a 2-3-year-old, and I wasn't throwing dinner parties, but I wanted there to be recipes that worked well for a dinner party or hosting a brunch, and that would, I could imagine what I wanted my life to be and what it will be again someday. And so thinking, okay, if I was going to throw a brunch for my friends, I wouldn't want to be getting up in the morning and making everything at the last minute. There's a shakshuka in here from Sammy Tamimi and Tara Wigley. It's one of the more complicated recipes in the book in that it has a longer ingredient list, but I really thought I could justify it being in a book called Simply Genius because you put it all together the night before and then you just warm up the sauce and scramble the eggs through. So rather than stressing about making sure all your poached eggs are evenly cooked, it's scrambled. And it's delicious. And it's so delicious that even like leftovers reheat well. So am I making it every weekend? No, but I wish it was in my life every weekend. I want to get to the place in life where I can make it more often. So I wanted to include those recipes too for people who might have a bit more time or ambition than me, but could still fit the recipes into their life. And there was still some aspect to it that made it less stressful, easier to really nail, easier to get to be more consistent and feel great making and serving.
That balance between accessible, easy, make it in a minute, and something that's more aspirational, and having both of those in there.
Right. I did also want to ask just how you keep up your fascination with finding recipes. How do you keep up? I mean, you said 12 years at Food 52, and that's a lot of recipes. That's a lot of books. That's a lot of work. And I know this book, especially, taking 4 years, working with a team that's in New York and you're out in California, that's a lot of energy. I mean, I could see that, okay, after book 3, I'm done with Genius Recipes for a bit. But so how do you keep up your passion for just like seeking out more ideas and always looking at what people in the food world are doing?
That is a great question. I think there's endless things to discover. And in the beginning, I used to try to find the one best X. Like when I was looking, I was like, I should have a ratatouille. And so I tried 4 different ratatouilles over the course of a weekend and picked my favorite and analyzed why I liked that one the best. But over the last 12 years, actually, the cover of the first Genius book is a good example of that because it was Marcella Hazan's tomato sauce with butter and onion. I thought, like, I don't need another tomato sauce. This is it forever. But I love that tomato sauce and I will turn to it forever. But there are other moments when you want something different. There's a 5-minute tomato sauce from Heidi Swanson in this book, whereas Marcella's maybe takes, 20, 30 minutes of simmering, not a big deal at all. And like almost no prep work required because you're just having the onion, not even chopping it. But that's for a moment where you want to like throw something on the stove and like putter a little bit, get your pasta boiling. When you need a sauce in 5 minutes and you want it to taste really like bright and alive, she has good tricks for that. So I think it's minced garlic, so that like blooms faster than half an onion would. A good amount of chili flakes, so it's a little spicy. And then lemon zest at the end makes like any tomato sauce taste juicier, I think. So it's another tomato sauce. I want both in my life. I think that's what has evolved. Is I'm not, I thought I might run out if I was looking for my one true best recipe of every category. But I opened that up pretty quickly. And my needs change too.
Right.
Having a kid changes everything.
That also changes what is possible for a weeknight dinner, right?
Yes.
And that all of a sudden, Heidi Swanson's tomato sauce to the rescue, I'm thinking.
Right.
Yep. I finally get it after, just years of, cooking dinner at whatever hour, eating it at whatever hour with just my husband. And now I really value being able to get dinner on the table so I can eat with my daughter and make recipes with my daughter that we can eat by 6:30.
Yeah, there's so much in this book that we can talk to you about, and we can go on and on. But I'm just so delighted that it's out this fall, and this will be the third in a pretty impressive line of books. So congratulations, and thanks for coming on to Everything Cookbooks and talking to us about it, Kristen.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your interest in this book. It means a lot.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you'd like to keep in touch, find us on Instagram at Everything Cookbooks and join the email list on our website, everythingcookbooks.com, for updates. If you have a minute, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get these podcasts. This helps more people find the show and builds the Everything Cookbooks community. Sincere thanks to our editor, Abby Sarquitella. Thanks for joining. We'll catch you next time. For now, keep on cooking.